This video was made possible thanks to the support of our amazing patrons. We couldn't do this without you.
Don't forget that you can support the channel for free and receive 10% off orders over $10 of Flipside Gaming by using the promo code Affinity at the checkout. Or if TCG Player or Magic Madhouse are more your thing, then be sure to place your order through our affiliate links in the description. Once again, at no extra cost to yourselves.
Hello and welcome to another EDH gameplay video brought to you by Affinity for Commander. My name's Martin.
And my name is Alex.
Today's video contains a lot of legends, heaps of wizards and dragons. So many dragons. So without further ado, let's take a look at those opening hands. I'm playing my Korvold Curse King Sacrifice deck. I keep an opening hand consisting of Viscera Seer, Seal of Primordium, Mayhem Devil, Gluttonous Troll, Cryptic Caves, Jungle Hollow and a Forest.
Thomas is playing as Naban, Dean of Iteration Control deck. His opening hand contains Altar of the Brood, Sky Diamond, Seagate Oracle, Baral's Expertise, Galecast of Colossus, Zaffirin Void, and an island.
Phil is playing as Karrthus, Tyrant of Jund Dragon Tribal deck. Shame about my commander's creature type. He keeps an opening hand of Kethis, God of Destiny, Journey of Discovery, Wasitora Nekuro Queen, Lathlis Dragon Queen, Kindred Dominance, Reflecting Pool and Overgrown Tomb.
And finally, Calvin is playing as Kethis, the Hidden Hand Legendary Tribal deck. His opening hand is made up of Krosan Grip, Urza's Ruinous Blast, Miari's Wake, Zetalpa Primal Dawn, Commander's Tower, Murmuring Bosk, and Jungle Hollow.
I win the die roll and start things off by playing Jungle Hollow. I gain a life and pass to Phil.
Phil plays Overgrown Tomb, having it enter tapped, and passes the turn.
Calvin also plays Jungle Hollow, gaining a life. He then ends his turn.
Thomas plays Zaffirin Void, and chooses to keep the top card of his library where it is. Next he casts Altar of the Brood, and passes to Martin.
I play a mountain and cast Viscera Seer. With nothing more to do, I pass the turn.
Phil plays Reflecting Pool and ends his turn.
Calvin plays Murmuring Bosk and passes to Thomas.
Thomas plays an island and everyone else mills a card thanks to his altar. Next he casts Sky Diamond, causing opponents to mill once more, and then passes the turn.
I play a forest and cast Mayhem Devil. Move into combat, I attack Thomas with Viscera Seer, dealing him 1 damage and then end my turn.
Phil draws, misses his land drop, discards down to 7 and passes to Calvin.
Calvin plays Command Tower and then casts his commander, Kethis the Hidden Hand. He then passes the turn.
Thomas plays Memorial to Genius, causing everybody else to mill 1, and then casts his commander, Naban, Dean of Iteration. Everybody other than Thomas mills 2 cards thanks to Naban's trigger copying ability, and Thomas ends his turn.
I play Jund Panorama and then cast Gluttonous Troll. I make 3 food tokens with the Troll's ETB and then move to combat. Here I attack Thomas with my Devil and Phil with my Seer, dealing them 3 and 1 damage respectively. Happy with my turn, I pass to Phil.
Phil draws, discards down to 7 and passes the turn. Oh dear.
Calvin plays Phyrexian Tower and then casts Urza's Ruinous Blast. I respond to this by sacrificing my Troll to Viscera Seer, dealing 1 damage to Thomas with my Mayhem Devil's ability. I then sacrifice the Seer to its own ability, dealing Thomas another damage, and resolve my 2 scry triggers. I put 1 card on the bottom of my library, keep the next one where it is, and Urza's Ruinous Blast exiles all non-legendary, non-land permanents in play. Moving to combat, Calvin attacks Thomas with his commander, dealing him 3 damage. With nothing more to do, Calvin ends the turn.
Thomas begins his turn by casting Frantic Search. He draws 2 cards, discards 2 cards, untaps 3 lands, and plays an island. Next, Thomas casts Martyr of Frost and passes to Martin.
I start my turn by casting Lightning Greaves, followed by Seal of Primordium. Next I cast Rakdos Guildgate and then pass the turn.
Phil plays Field of the Dead, which, sadly for him, comes in tapped, and ends his turn.
Calvin plays Witch's Cottage, which enters tapped, and then casts a DC Undead Vizier. He chooses not to sacrifice a creature to her exploit ability, moves to combat, and attacks me with Kethis. I take 3 damage, and Calvin passes to Thomas.
Thomas moves straight to combat, attacking Martin with both of his wizards. He takes 3 damage, and Thomas passes the turn.
I play Cryptic Caves and then cast my commander, Korvold, Fey Cursed King. I sacrifice Seal of Primordium to Korvold's ETB, putting a +1/+1 counter on him and drawing a card. Next I equip my Lightning Greaves to my commander, and Thomas responds by flashing in Merfolk Trickster. He taps my Dragon King along with Sidisi, and the Speedy Shoes then become equipped to my tapped creature. With nothing more to do, I end my turn.
Phil begins his turn by casting Journey of Discovery, searching his library for a mountain and a forest. He then plays the mountain and passes to Calvin.
Calvin starts his turn by casting Balls of Citadel, which Thomas responds to by sacrificing his Mortar of Frost to its own ability. He reveals Rescue, countering the Citadel, and Calvin moves to combat. He attacks Thomas with Sidisi, dealing him 4 damage, and then ends his turn.
Thomas casts Baral, Chief of Compliance, and passes the turn.
I play Field of Ruin and then cast everybody's favourite goblin, Squee the Immortal. Next I cast Sifter of Skulls and move to combat. I attack Calvin with my commander, sacrificing Squee to his ability. I put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold, draw a card, and make a 1/1 draws a Scion token thanks to my Sifter's ability. Unable to block, Calvin takes 6 damage, and I end my turn.
Phil plays a forest and then casts Phyrexian Delver. Thomas responds to this by casting Impulse, putting one of the top 4 cards of his library into his hand. The Delver then resolves and Phil takes 7 damage to return Dracoseth, Maw of Flames, to the battlefield. Happy with how his turn went, Phil passes to Calvin.
Calvin plays a forest and then casts Miori's Wake. He then contemplates attacking, but ultimately decides not to and passes the turn.
Thomas plays an island and ends his turn. Typical blue player move right there.
I cast my own copy of Sidisi Undead Vizier, sacrificing Sifter of Skulls to her exploit ability. I put a +1/+1 counter on my commander, draw a card and search my library for a card before putting it into my hand. I then pass to Phil.
Phil begins his turn by casting Karrthus, God of Destiny, and then moves to combat. Thomas responds by casting Supreme Will, looking at the top 4 cards of his library and putting one of them into his hand. Phil then attacks Calvin with Dracoseth, dealing 4 damage to Calvin, 3 damage to Martin, and 3 damage to Baral with his ability. Thomas responds by casting the Rescue that he revealed earlier, bouncing Baral back to his hand. Calvin then takes 7 damage from combat, and Phil passes the turn.
Calvin plays a Swamp and then casts a Tulpa Primal Dawn. Thomas quickly counters the Dino with a cheeky Wizard's Retort, and Calvin exiles 2 cards from his graveyard to activate Kethis' ability. Next he casts Urza's Ruinous Blast from his graveyard, and I respond by sacrificing my Scion to its own ability. I put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold, draw a card, and the blast then resolves. Merfolk Trickster, Lightning Greaves, Phyrexian Delver and Miori's Wake are exiled, and I sacrifice my Jund Panorama, searching my library for a forest and putting it into play tapped. Korvold gains another +1/+1 counter, I draw once more, and Calvin expresses his immediate regret for casting the blast, thinking that Miori's Wake was a legendary enchantment. To be fair to him, it really ought to be. With nothing more to do, Calvin ends his turn.
Thomas recasts Baral and passes to Martin.
I play a Swamp and cast Mazarek, Kroll Death Priest. Thomas responds by casting Remand, countering the creature and returning it to my hand. Thomas draws a card from his spell, draws and discards with Baral, and I cast Eldritch Evolution. I sacrifice Sidisi, searching my library for Butcher of Malakir and putting him into play. I then put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold, draw a card and move to combat. I attack Phil with my commander, sacrificing a forest to his ability. I put another +1/+1 counter on my dragon, draw another card, and Phil takes 11 damage. I then pass the turn.
In his pre-combat main phase, Phil exiles the Sidisi in Martin's graveyard with Closest ability. He gains 2 life, deals 2 damage to each of his opponents, and then plays Woodland Cemetery. Field of the Dead triggers, making Phil a 2/2 zombie, and Phil casts his commander, Karrthus, Tyrant of Jund. He gains control of Korvold, untaps him, and moves to combat. Here he attacks Calvin with Korvold and Karrthus, Thomas with Kethis, and Martin with Drakuseth. Drakuseth's ability triggers, and Phil decides to deal 4 damage to Butcher of Malakir, 3 damage to Baral, and 3 damage to Calvin. The Vampire and Wizard are destroyed, and the Butcher's ability triggers. Phil sacrifices his zombie, Calvin sacrifices Sidisi, and Thomas sacrifices Naban. And Phil then puts a +1/+1 counter on Korvold and draws a card. Next he sacrifices a mountain to Korvold's attack trigger, putting another +1/+1 counter on the dragon and drawing another card. Calvin then takes 22 damage, reducing his life total to 0, Thomas takes 4 and Martin takes 7. Phil then ends his turn.
Thomas plays an island and then casts Baral's Expertise. He returns all 3 of Phil's dragons to their owner's hands, chooses not to cast the spell for free, and passes to me.
Martin begins his turn by recasting Werq, Crawl Death Priest, and then plays Terramorphic Expanse. Next he casts Priest of the Forgotten Gods and passes the turn.
Phil exiles my Butcher of Malakir in its pre-combat main phase, gaining 2 life and dealing 2 damage to Thomas and myself. Next Phil plays Sheltered Thicket, creating a zombie, and casts Dragon Lord Colligan. Moving to combat, Phil attacks Thomas with his Hasty Dragon. Thomas takes 6 damage, and Phil discards down to 7 before ending his turn.
Thomas starts his turn by casting Compulsive Research, drawing 3 cards and discarding an island. He then passes to Martin, who responds by sacrificing Terramorphic Expanse, searching his library for a swamp and putting it into play. Werq triggers, putting a +1/+1 counter on each of Martin's creatures, and Martin moves to his turn.
I play Savage Lands and cast Woe Strider. I make a 0/1 goat with the Strider's ETB, and then cast Smothering Abomination. Next I activate my Priest's ability, sacrificing Woe Strider and my goat. I put 2 +1/+1 counters on each of my creatures, draw 2 cards, and have both of my opponents lose 2 life. Phil then sacrifices his zombie, triggering Werq once more, and I put another +1/+1 counter on all of my creatures. Man, I love the synergy of this deck. I add 2 black mana to my mana pool, which I use to help cast Yeheni, Undying Partisan, and then move to combat. I attack Phil with my Insect Shaman and Thomas with my Aetherborn Vampire, dealing them 6 and 2 damage respectively. Out of spells to cast, I pass the turn.
Phil exiles Woe Strider in his pre-combat main phase, gaining 2 life and dealing 2 damage to Thomas and Martin. Next he casts Kindred Dominance, naming Elder, and Martin responds by sacrificing his priest to Yeheni's ability. He puts a +1/+1 counter on each of his remaining creatures, draws a card, and sacrifices Eldrazi to Yeheni. He puts another +1/+1 counter on his creatures, draws a card, and sacrifices Werq to Yeheni before letting the board wipe resolve. 0 creatures are destroyed given that Kethis and Yeheni have Indestructible, and Phil then moves to combat. He attacks Martin with Colligan, dealing him 6 damage, and moves to his second main phase. Here he plays Unclaimed Territory, naming Dragon, and creates a zombie before ending his turn.
Thomas plays an island and recasts his commander. With nothing more to do, Thomas passes to me.
Martin begins his turn by casting Catacomb Sifter, creating a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion with its ETB. Next he casts Zulaport Cutthroat, followed by Vindictive Vampire, revealing the Aristocrat sub-theme of his deck in a glorious fashion. Moving to combat, Martin attacks Thomas with Yeheni, and Thomas blocks the Vampire with Naban. Martin then passes the turn.
Phil exiles an island from Thomas's graveyard, adding a red and green mana to his mana pool. He then plays Temple of the False God, creating another zombie, and casts Atarka, World Render. Moving to combat, Phil attacks me with Colligan, dealing me a hefty 12 damage thanks to the double strike provided by Atarka. In his second main phase, Phil casts Defense of the Heart, and remembers that Atarka would have had haste thanks to Colgan, cursing himself for not noticing before combat. Lucky for me, I guess. Deeply saddened, Phil ends his turn.
Thomas casts Ether Spell Bomb and then passes to Martin. I hope he has a trick up his sleeve, or this game will be over very soon.
I start my turn by casting Mad Ratter and then play Golgari Rot Form, returning a swamp to my hand. Next I sacrifice Cryptic Cave, drawing a card, and create 2 1/1 rat tokens with my Ratter's ability. Still not finished, I cast Awakening Zone and pass the turn.
In Phil's upkeep, Defense of the Heart triggers, and Thomas counters the triggered ability by casting Disallow. Phil then exiles the Disallow that Thomas just cast with Kethis' ability, and Martin responds by sacrificing a rat to Yahenni. Both his Zulaport Cutthroat and Vindictive Vampire trigger, draining Phil and Thomas for 2 life and gaining him 2 life. Martin scries 1 with Catacomb Sifter, and Kethis' ability then resolves, gaining Phil 2 life and dealing Thomas and Martin 2 damage. Finally, in his main phase, Phil casts Kindred Summons. He puts Scourge of the Throne and Balefire Dragon into play this way, and then moves to combat. Phil attacks Thomas with Kethis and a zombie, and Martin with his 4 dragons, to which Thomas responds by flashing in Portal Mage. Displeased by Thomas's action, Martin responds to the wizard being cast by sacrificing 3 creatures to Yahenni. Thomas responds to this by sacrificing his spell bomb, targeting Yahenni, and Martin responds by sacrificing the rest of his creatures to his Aetherborn, draining his opponents for 5 life. The original Cutthroat and Vampire triggers then resolve, but it isn't enough to save Martin from Phil's army of dragons, leaving Phil as the victor.
Well, that's it for another game. Hope that you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget that you can help to support the channel in 4 quick and easy ways. Liking this video, subscribing, hitting the bell icon and leaving us a comment. I read every one. Also, feel free to check out our Patreon, Twitter and Facebook pages. Links to all are in the video description. That's all for now, we'll see you next time. Stay safe out there.